Welcome back. This week, we're doing our deep dive into the pro-Kremlin information space, looking specifically at the week of June 2nd through June 8th, 2025.
That's right. We've been digging into recent analysis covering the significant events and, maybe more importantly, the persistent narrative trends during that period.
And the goal here, as always for you, our listener, who's already familiar with the basics of disinformation, isn't just what they said, but how the machine worked this week. We want to unpack the tactics, the themes, the responses we observed.
Extracting those key insights, seeing the playbook in action, and maybe where it showed some strain.
Exactly. So let's get into it. It seems like a pretty active week on the ground impacted the narrative quite a bit.
It certainly did. That analysis highlights several significant Ukrainian actions right at the start of the week, around June 1st onwards. There were those widespread drone strikes, dubbed Operation Spiderweb, hitting multiple Russian military airfields.
Right, across Russia itself.
Yeah, and then you also had a railway bridge collapse reported in the Bryansk region, and another attack, this one underwater, apparently targeting the Kerch Bridge again.
Okay, so these aren't minor incidents. They're hitting strategic assets. And the analysis points out this immediately challenges that core Kremlin narrative, doesn't it? The whole Russia is invincible, Ukraine is defeated story.
Precisely. It just doesn't fit. And you could see that reflected in the initial documented response. The first instinct seemed to be downplaying.
How so?
Well, for example, the Russian military eventually, and kind of reluctantly, admitted only that several pieces of military equipment had caught fire after those airfield strikes, which, given the likely scale, sounds like a significant understatement.
A very careful phrasing. And was there much from the top leadership initially?
That's another key point the analysis flags: the silence. Putin himself was publicly quiet for days after those major drone strikes hit.
And that quiet period is telling.
It really is. You could almost see the ripple effect down the chain. Take someone like Vladimir Solovyov, usually very quick, very bombastic.
Right.
He referred to what was clearly a successful, large-scale Ukrainian military operation simply as unpleasant incidents.
Unpleasant incidents. That's quite the euphemism.
It is, and the analysis links that kind of uncharacteristic restraint directly to a likely delay in the marching orders, the temnik coming down from the Kremlin. They didn't have the approved line yet.
Okay, so if the central guidance is slow, what happens? Does the system just wait?
Not entirely. It seems to default to a kind of standard operating procedure. The analysis lays out the fallback tactics they used while waiting for that clearer guidance.
What are those steps?
Well, step 1, downplay the impact. We saw that already. Step 2, vilify Ukraine and play the victim card. Hard.
Ah, okay. So accusing Ukraine of
terrorism immediately. Even though these were strikes against legitimate military installations under the laws of war, it's that immediate pivot to painting Ukraine as the aggressor, the terrorist state.
Which is classic projection, isn't it? Accusing the other side of what you're doing or intend to do.
Absolutely. Then, step 3. Start peddling unfounded conspiracy theories. Anything to muddy the waters.
Such as?
Oh, the usual suspects. Claims that British strategists masterminded the attacks, or that London was using Ukraine specifically to try and undermine Russia's nuclear triad.
The Anglo-Saxons are always lurking in the shadows when something goes wrong for the Kremlin narrative.
It's a reliable trope for them. And finally, step 4. While downplaying the actual damage, simultaneously ramp up the rhetoric about Russia's overall invincibility and, crucially, add a layer of nuclear saber-rattling.
Ah, the nuclear threats.
Yes, the analysis calls it a calibrated tactic of nuclear saber-rattling, usually tied to these vaguely defined red lines that seem to shift constantly. It's about projecting strength even when you've just suffered a blow.
It's fascinating how they tried to spin Ukraine's motive, too. The analysis mentions claims that Kyiv was attacking specifically to derail peace talks.
Right, which seems counterintuitive. But the analysis offers that sharp counterpoint. These strikes aren't about derailing peace. They actually demonstrate Kyiv's commitment to achieving a just peace by degrading Russia's ability to continue waging war. It flips the whole narrative.
And this whole pattern, the initial silence or downplaying the delay, then falling back on these pre-cooked narratives, it feels like we've seen this before when they're caught off guard.
We have. The analysis explicitly connects this week's reaction to previous instances where that centralized control seemed to falter when faced with major unexpected events.
Like after the Crocus City Hall attack.
Exactly. Putin was out of public view for about 19 hours then, wasn't he? And the propaganda machine seemed similarly stuck for a bit before defaulting to worn-out narratives.
And the Wagner Mutiny in 2023.
Even more starkly, Putin took nearly 2 days to really define the official line on that, and you could see the propagandists visibly struggling, almost improvising in the meantime. It was quite something to watch.
So, this week's events, the reaction to them, it's another data point showing an inherent weakness in that system.
It really seems to be. It highlights that vulnerability in a system supposedly built on total information control. When the leader is silent or the message is delayed, the system can seize up temporarily.
It recovers, though.
Oh, it does. It eventually realigns, just like after Crocus or Wagner, and it did this week too. But as the analysis rightly notes, these cracks have been exposed. For anyone watching closely, understanding this sort of predictable stumble is key to understanding how the system functions and where its limits are.
Okay, that gives a very clear picture of how they handle sudden shocks. Now let's shift gears a bit. The analysis also spent significant time on the more persistent day-in, day-out disinformation efforts, particularly targeting specific countries and events like elections. Poland seemed to be a major focus this week.
Absolutely. Poland is, as the analysis underscores, a long-standing target. And the hostility isn't just occasional, it's consistently intense. The rhetoric is often extreme, even outside election periods, things like calling Poland the ultimate warmongering evil or the Russophobic hyena.
So the Polish presidential election runoff on June 1st between Naraki and Trzaskowski just provided a focal point for this ongoing campaign.
Exactly. It wasn't necessarily about inventing brand new themes, but applying their standard election interference playbook with extra intensity. All the greatest hits were there. Smearing the leaders, trying to sow distrust in the democratic process itself, flooding social media with anti-Ukraine stuff, lots of projection.
And trying to dismiss the results afterwards, presumably.
Oh, definitely. That's part of the package, too. But looking at the specific anti-Polish narratives pushed this week, projection was a big one.
Meaning accusing Poland of things that are actually problems within Russia.
Precisely that. We saw claims that Poland is mired in a deep crisis. Poverty, runaway inflation, corruption, even people apparently panic withdrawing cash from banks. It often mirrors anxieties or realities, perceived or real, within Russia itself.
Beyond projection, what else? There was a focus on painting Poland as aggressive.
Very much so. A constant drumbeat of narratives alleging Poland is secretly preparing troops for a preemptive strike on Russia, or that it has designs on Kaliningrad, or is actively planning Russia's conquest.
Fantastical claims, really.
And sometimes quite crude, like the claim Poland smells the decaying flesh of Ukraine because of its supposed imperialist ambitions. It's all designed to paint Poland as a threat, justifying Russia's own stance.
And just a general undercurrent of hostility in the tone.
Constant, calling Poland sick with Russophobia, claiming Warsaw was desperately looking for any excuse to break diplomatic ties, accusing politicians of using the election to lobby for U.S. nukes on Polish soil. It's relentless negativity.
The analysis breaks down the campaign disinformation into three main narrative streams, which is helpful. The first was this idea of a shadow fight.
Right. This narrative basically said the Polish election wasn't about Poles choosing their leader. No, it was actually a hidden battle between foreign powers.
Foreign powers like.
They mentioned Trump, Brussels, Soros globalists. Specific commentary tried to assign backers like Naraki was supposedly backed by Trump or forces pushing this intermarium project idea.
Sort of Central Eastern European bloc concept.
Yeah, sometimes framed that way. Well, Trzaskowski was allegedly backed by Brussels, Berlin, and the U.S. Democrats.
So the goal here is to delegitimize the whole process, make it seem like Poles aren't really in control.
Exactly. Portraying both sides, despite political differences, as ultimately serving some anti-Russian foreign agenda, it undermines the idea of a sovereign Polish choice.
What else did that narrative include?
Some pretty cynical stuff. Claims about foreign spies using the election to stir up trouble between, quote, crooks and perverts, portraying Polish voters as naive sheep with Stockholm syndrome. Wow.
And predictions that European elites would never accept a Trzaskowski loss, that the EU is becoming a totalitarian liberal dictatorship, and the European Commission might even challenge a Naraki win, all designed to sow chaos and distrust.
Okay, what was the second major narrative identified?
This one was focused squarely on Ukraine. The Ukraine is the main loser narrative. The idea was no matter who won in Poland, Ukraine would suffer.
How did they push that?
by claiming anti-Ukrainian feelings were actually deciding the Polish election, saying Poles were fed up with supporting Ukraine and refugees, which was supposedly boosting the far right, asserting that both Nawrocki and Trzaskowski were competing to sound more anti-Ukrainian, even claiming Kyiv was in a state of hysteria over how Poles allegedly felt about them.
So trying to drive a wedge between Poland and Ukraine, make Ukrainians feel isolated, and maybe even create a self-fulfilling prophecy by amplifying negativity.
That seems to be the aim. It fits the broader strategy of turning European publics against supporting Ukraine.
And the third narrative stream. This one sort of tied it together. Both candidates are hardline Russophobes.
The message being, it doesn't matter who wins, Poland will still be hostile to Russia.
Precisely. The analysis quotes one commentator distinguishing Trzaskowski's supposed personal grievances from Nawrocki's historical problems with Russia, but the conclusion was the same. Bilateral relations won't improve, Warsaw will remain aggressive.
Implying Polish policy is fixed regardless of leadership or Russian action.
Yes. The core message was that Warsaw just wants Ukraine to keep fighting Russia, and the election outcome is irrelevant because both candidates are fundamentally anti-Russian.
The analysis also mentioned a particularly nasty comparison used on social media.
Ugh, yes. Comparing the choice in the election to, and this is a direct crude quote, looking for a Maidan who is a symbol of women's virtues in a cheap port brothel.
Using Maidan there as a slur for political upheaval or protest, it's incredibly toxic.
It really is, and it highlights the kind of inflammatory, misogynistic content that unfortunately often gets amplified by algorithms because it provokes strong reactions.
So, given this barrage, how did the pro-Kremlin outlets react when Karol Nawrocki actually won on June 2nd?
The immediate spin, according to the analysis, was essentially, Trump is now Poland's president. They framed Nawrocki's win as the beginning of Europe's Trumpization.
Interesting framing.
They called it a slap in the face for Brussels and explicitly a gift for President Trump.
Which fits perfectly into their long-running narrative of mocking the EU and predicting its imminent decline or fragmentation.
Absolutely. And they also quickly emphasized that Nawrocki is actually on Russia's own wanted list for demolishing Soviet-era monuments.
Using that as proof of his inherent anti-Russian stance.
Exactly. Framing it as evidence that his foreign policy will inevitably be hardline no matter what Russia does. So again, it's dismissing the democratic result by saying the outcome was preordained by the candidate's supposed Russophobia, while also painting Russia as the victim of this unchanging hostility.
It's a complex but consistent set of tactics. Okay, let's shift to the third major theme from this week's analysis. The strategic framing of global powers, specifically the way they contrasted the US and Europe regarding Ukraine. There seemed to be a noticeable shift there.
Yes, there really was. If you look at the pro-Kremlin messaging from this week and actually stretching back over recent months, there's a definite divergence. Europe and Ukraine are consistently painted in negative terms, irrational, warmongering vassals, essentially.
But the US?
The US, and particularly President Trump, received a much more positive, or at least strategically positive, framing. It was quite striking.
A deliberate effort to go positive on the US, especially Trump.
It seems so. Lots of praise for him, suggestions that his views actually align with Russia's interests, like on Ukraine accepting Russian terms for a ceasefire. It was sometimes portrayed as potentially the only leader who understands the need to address the root causes of the conflict.
And let's be clear, root causes in Kremlin terminology usually means Ukraine's surrender, Russia keeping occupied territories, and the U.S. pulling back from Europe, right?
That's the subtext, absolutely. And the analysis gave concrete examples. RT quoting commentators saying the U.S. is more reasonable and less bellicose than its European vassals.
Okay.
RT France even ran a headline. The United States wants peace, Europe wants war. You had Russian officials and pundits quoted saying Trump's desire for peace is genuine, that he and Putin will achieve their goals, and even that Trump sees Putin as an equal needed for excellent deals.
That framing feels very purposeful.
Yeah.
Trying to elevate Russia's status by suggesting a potential partnership or understanding with a U.S. leader, reinforcing that whole great power negotiation image.
It definitely looks like a calculated move. Part of that effort to maintain the myth of invincibility and strategic importance. But the analysis also cautions that this Trump praise hasn't been a constant stream. It has its ebbs and flows.
Reacting to events.
Yeah, seemingly tied to specific statements or actions. For instance, digging into Polish language pro-Kremlin outlets revealed more skepticism at times. Claims the Trump-Zelensky meeting was just staged by the deep state, or that Trump was actually deceiving Russia, or the U.S. couldn't be trusted as a negotiator.
And didn't Trump say something about WWII that contradicted their historical narrative?
Right, there was a dip in the positive coverage after Trump made claims about the U.S. role in winning World War II, which clashed hard with Russia's deeply ingrained narrative about the Soviet Union's singular victory.
But then the positive framing ramped up again after that Trump-Putin phone call back on May 19th.
It did. The analysis noted commentary describing that call as a failure for anyone hoping for conflict between them. It highlighted, quotes, pushing this idea of two global camps, a Russian-American one working towards peace versus a Ukraine-Europe camp bent on continuing the conflict.
With the implication that European warmongers would be sidelined.
Explicitly,
Yeah.
that they would lose their place at the negotiating table.
And that European warmongers theme that seems incredibly consistent, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Running through everything this week.
Absolutely, it's a constant, often framing the entire conflict as a proxy war, not just Russia versus Ukraine, but maybe U.S.-Russia versus Ukraine-UK.
Where did you see examples of that?
The analysis pulled them from outlets targeting various audiences: Uzbekistan, Armenia, Russian domestic TV, Azerbaijan, all pushing similar lines. Europe is determined to keep the war going. Europe wants to break Russia. Europe is obsessed with prolonging this conflict.
And they weave in the anti-elite angle there, too.
Yes, claims about powerful European business dynasties wanting war to sell weapons, or shattery globalist elites pushing for conflict with Russia for their own nefarious reasons. It taps into that populist anti-establishment sentiment.
Was there specific pushback on any particular European proposals?
Yes, the idea of a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine got shot down hard, labeled toxic, unfeasible, escalatory, reckless.
And linked back to the nuclear threats again.
Often, yes, implying that such a move would cross some undefined but dangerous red line.
Okay, so summing up this part, the shifting U.S.-Europe narrative looks like a clear strategic play.
It really does. The analysis suggests it's a propaganda effort designed to exploit any transatlantic tensions, isolate Ukraine and the EU, and try to legitimize Russia's own maximalist demands. How? By painting the U.S., especially under Trump, as a potentially rational partner for peace, while Europe is consistently depicted as the irrational warmongering obstacle.
And Russia's own actions, like keeping a low profile in those Turkey talks, fit this narrative.
It seems consistent. By sending only a limited delegation, they sort of reinforce the idea that they aren't the ones blocking progress, shifting the focus and blame onto others, particularly Europe.
Right. Well, this deep dive into the analysis for that week certainly paints a picture. We've seen that, that predictable stumble when faced with unexpected setbacks, exposing those vulnerabilities in their control system.
And the relentless, almost obsessive focus on specific targets like Poland, using events like elections to amplify long-standing hostile narratives heavy on projection and distortion.
In this quite sophisticated strategic effort to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Europe in their global messaging, trying to isolate Kyiv and Brussels.
And understanding these patterns, as you said earlier, isn't just about spotting individual lies. For anyone tracking this space, it's about seeing the playbook, how it operates, how it adapts, and crucially, where it seems to consistently run into trouble.
It is. Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. Given these observable stumbles we've discussed, the delays after setbacks, the inconsistencies in managing complex relationships like U.S.-Europe, what does this week's analysis really suggest are the most persistent systemic weaknesses in their overall information control strategy?
It does make you wonder if the very structure designed for that total control, so reliant on top-down directives and repeating known tropes, might actually be its biggest vulnerability when faced with the genuinely unexpected or complex. Something to think about.